Welcome, summoners of the undead.
Hey, this is Khan. Necromancer recently had its biggest update since it launched in 2019. It's really back on form thanks to Runecarver and is getting another buff in Gold Road. So why do so many players say that it sucks? Because they're wrong, and that's okay, it happens. Luckily, your devoted servants at Ninja Pulls are here to set everything straight, with a proper deep dive into the new and not so new Necromancer for PvE. We'll go over different setups, the pros and cons, Magicka versus Stamina, Blast Bones versus Sacrifice, race, gear, CPs, traits and enchantments, and the best rotations from my testing. We won't get into scribing, that's situational, and we're not just talking about perfect optimization here. Arcanist and Dragonknight DDs are still favoured by score push groups, but 99% of us play in very different conditions, where Necromancer can perform the same or even better. All I want to do is prove that Necro is underrated and help you get really good at it. First, passives. Best way to understand any class. 3 of the big ones are in the Gravelord skill line. Reusable parts, great for sustain if we keep summoning. Death Knell, a passive execute, really strong, so 3 Gravelord abilities on the front bar whenever you can. Dismember, free pen so long as we use Necro skills. Rapid Rot is crucial. A 10% dot boost is so big that it pretty much dictates how we play the class. In Bone Tyrant, Death Cleaning, more sustain. Disdain Harm is why Necro tanks are so good in a lot of tough content. As DDs, we won't get that extra mitigation unless we use Bone Armor or Hungry Scythe, in solo content for instance. Health Avarice, same. We only use Necrotic Potency in trash and that's it. Last Gasp, free health. We'll take it. And in Living Death, Curative Curse kicks in when you have negative effects on you, which can happen in group content and happens a lot in solo content, boosting heals like Scythe and Pale Order. Near-death experience we can ignore. Corpse Consumption is awesome. Every class has a passive like this, typically 1 ultimate every 2 seconds, max. But this is way more generous because it requires a corpse. So if we play correctly and keep consuming corpses, we can build ultimate a little faster than other classes. Undead Confederate, again, more sustain if we keep summoning. Loads of goodies in there if we use the Necro toolkit correctly. It can be hard to remember all this stuff, but keep these 4 in mind at least, and if you need a quick reminder, ninjapulls.com lists the key passives at the top of every guide. Now, Magicka or Stamina? Both work great actually. If you want to use Blast Bones, Stamina has the advantage. It can use Rapid Strikes and Coral Riptide, but Rapid Strikes looks further ahead on the dummy because it's cheaper than Venom Skull and lets us use max stamina food to boost our damage. In content, you'll probably use Bystat food, and then Rapid Strikes isn't as far ahead. It's also a channel, whereas Skull is a smooth, instant cast with a 28 meter range and which doesn't interfere with block or bar swap. On the dummy, none of this matters, but in content, it can. So yeah, Rapid Strikes is nice, but not a game changer. The more obvious point is that Blast Bones is now only a stamina ability, so Magicka Necros will need potions for stamina recovery if they use it. That works fine, thanks to hybridization, but it's easier and sometimes safer to have that large stamina pool. So if you really don't have a preference, go stamina. But if you prefer Magicka, don't worry. In dungeons and trials, I bet most players will get similar damage with either. With a dot rotation, they're almost identical. With a spammable, Stamina pulls ahead, but Magicka has more cleave, and with Gravelord Sacrifice, Magicka might be the better choice. All of these numbers go up a bit with a detonating Siphon buff. So Blast Bones has more damage, more cleave, and better sustain. Sacrifice is like a Blast Bones that hugs you after 2 seconds, buffs your dots and class abilities for 20 seconds, and creates a corpse and explosion with every 3rd skull cast. It makes the rotation less hectic, and it buffs your Scythe damage, great for solo content. But remember our passives. Sacrifice won't get as much out of reusable parts, and possibly corpse consumption. In fact, running out of corpses with this new morph is a big complaint for some people. To be honest, it hasn't happened to me much. I just keep Boneyard and Siphon casts far apart, and it works fine. But I've seen other people complaining, so I thought I should mention it. Gravelord Sacrifice and Skull go together, so a lot depends on the morph you're using. Ricochet Skull costs Magicka and the 3rd cast bounces twice for more AoE damage. Venom Skull costs stamina, and the third more powerful cast happens more often because any class ability counts towards the stacks. That's more single target damage. Which is better? Well, boss damage is what matters. So even if Ricochet gets those fat cleave numbers, Venom Skull is the superior morph, right? In theory, yes, Ricochet deals 7.5k DPS to 2 extra targets and explodes for 60k every few seconds, roughly 8k DPS per target. Venom Skull does not bounce, but recasting Sacrifice, Archer and Siphon every 20 seconds, Boneyard every 10 seconds, that should be 5 more big skulls and explosions per minute, an extra 2k boss damage and an extra 13k per additional target. So it kinda ends up neck and neck, in theory. In practice, it's weaker because often we're already at 2 skull stacks, and recasting class abilities then has 0 benefit. I ran a ton of dummy tests to demonstrate, here are the averages. Ricochet Skull behaves as expected, but because Venom Skull gets fewer pops, against 1 target it's barely ahead, and with 2 and 3 targets it gets further and further behind. It will slowly catch up again, and single target damage is a bit higher, but if you're using Sacrifice and not Blast Bones, there is a case to be made for Magicka Necromancer being the better choice. Also keep in mind that Ricochet is flame damage, so the explosion it causes when Sacrifice is running is also flame damage, and is buffed by engulfing flames on the dummy, and by Enchants if you have it in your group. Flame damage is actually 47% of our total, so it really does make a difference. Stamina Necromancer also has a lot of flame damage thanks to Runecarver, but the more interesting set here would be Morag Tong, which buffs poison and disease damage almost as much as Enchants and Engulfing combined. That applies to Blighted Blastbones and Venom Skull and Detonating Siphon, but it's not super common unless your group is stacking as your Blight. So you've got options, basically. These are just dummy tests, not all targets will get the same debuff, some will die or get separated, the numbers are not a perfect indicator. The point is that Necromancer can compete for single target damage without needing heroism potions, and it has more options. Let's face it, every Arcanist is the same, and many players want to break from it at this point. Plus, the Necro Cleave is always awesome. It's a big radius and not just a straight line, and unlike DK Talons, which hit 6 meters around you, Blastbones or Skull hit around the target, which is often better. Of course, Arcanist has that burst and range, and DK gets so much more benefit from Pillagers and Enchants. Again, I'm not trying to knock these classes off their spots, just saying that Necro is closer than you think. One more quick note about Skull, if you use the add-on Action Duration Reminder, you may see a weird and annoying behaviour where your Boneyard icon keeps getting moved by the Skull tracker, so it's hard to see the timer. It may get fixed, but you can go into Settings, Add-ons, ADR, and in the Core drop-down, you can manually blacklist these abilities. I checked all the different codes for Skull, and these were the ones that fixed it for me. Hopefully it'll work for you guys as well. Moving on. Ultimately, I bet many players will choose Magicka or Stamina based on the feel of it and not the numbers. If we're gonna spend hours and hours with a character, it should be one that we like playing and feel invested in. So it's cool that Magicka and Stamina both have their strengths, but hopefully the numbers give you a sense of the trade-offs. What about race? As always, High Elf for Magicka, Dark Elf for Stamina are the top choices. Khajiit is close behind, and both Khajiit and Dark Elf can switch between Magicka and Stamina, which is why they're so popular. But it does not make a huge difference. Yes, extra stats and free damage are always welcome, but if you're playing in optimized conditions and took out all your racial passives, you'd only lose something like 5% of your power at the most. So don't let people freak you out that you chose the wrong race. If you want a Khajiit, Orc, Bosma, or whatever, go for it. If you do decide later that min-maxing is the most important thing, you can always race change. Khajiit is tricky to rank accurately because of the Feline Ambush passive, which gives you 12% critical damage and healing. This is a big bonus and puts Khajiit at the top unless you're already close to the crit cap, then it can be wasted. Again, don't worry too much about it. In casual groups and especially in dungeons, it's very handy. You'll just have to adjust your setup a little differently for more optimized groups, like dropping the kilt and running a monster set. Also, don't overlook the High Elf passive Spell Recharge, which boosts stamina recovery on Magicka characters. This has become extremely valuable since hybridization, especially if you're using a 2H backbar. So if you know you're making a Magicka Necromancer, I'd give this race serious consideration. Also, a tall, thin High Elf suits the Necro vibe perfectly, and the crazy customization in this game means you can have a lot of fun playing with the creepy look. Okay, so we talk passives, mag versus stam, 2 playstyles, and race, and the Necromancer is looking pretty flexible. You can go in various different directions without losing too much power. I think a lot of players like that. Now let's talk gear. Runecarver's Blaze is the main reason Necro is performing better this patch. The set was already decent in the right situation, but now it applies burning more often. It's worth using almost anywhere. This set is a Necromancer's wet dream. It adds a tick of flame damage to every 3rd tick of your dots. All your dots. And those that tick more often get more damage from it, and that's the key. Sticky dots like Degeneration or Scalding Rune that are applied to the target tick every 2 seconds. But ground dots that damage everything in the area, like Stampede, Wall of Elements, Endless Hail, these tick every second. Boneyard is the same, and Siphon actually ticks 1.5 times per second. So it gets way more Runecarver ticks per cast. Plus, Rapid Rot makes all these dots more powerful. Take note that other proc sets do not activate Runecarver, and nor do status effects. Because of all this, Necromancers can get 14 or even 15k DPS out of Runecarver, and it works great even with a spammable rotation. So once you've picked a Minor Slayer set, usually Reliquien or Riptide, I think Runecarver is a no-brainer for most boss fights. That can also be a drawback. It's cool when Zos find ways to indirectly buff certain classes via a set or something else, but the fact that Necro seems only to be genuinely competitive with this set equipped is a shame. Also, it is light armor. That's nice if you're low on penetration or Magicka sustain, but it's also a drawback since we can't front bar the set and must wear at least 2 light pieces, which isn't always optimal. Also, that line of penetration may be wasted if your supports are doing their job, but the pros generally outweigh the cons. Coral Riptide is tricky to combine with Runecarver, but can be done if you front bar it. Most players will stick with Reliquien because it's easier, it's buffed by Rapid Rot, and works practically anywhere unless you really need to burn many targets at once. Other trial sets work too, just keep in mind their relative drawbacks, shown here in brackets. Azure Blight is kinda similar to Runecarver, but can pull ahead when there are at least 3 stacked targets for all or most of the fight. But the set does have a per target cooldown, so the more people in your group that are running it, the more likely it is that Azure Blight ticks will have to be shared and Runecarver would give you more consistent damage. I wouldn't pair up Runecarver with Elemental Catalyst since they're both light, but hopefully that won't be an issue once the Lucid Echoes set arrives. For the Mythic, Necromancer needs that critical damage, so we want the kilt wherever feasible. If it isn't, and you want to slot a crit CP instead, or if your character is a Khajiit, use another damage mythic or a monster set. But if you can run the kilt, do it. The stats are just awesome. If you do have room for a monster set, we already get so much burning from Runecarver that Zahn brings less value than it used to. And the fat proc damage and extra uptime on Overcharge from Kjalnar or Sundered from Selene can perform better. Finally, it may seem weird to use the Maelstrom 2H, which buffs direct damage, on a class famous for its damage over time, but Blast Bones, Runecarver procs, light attacks, Archer, and Siphon detonations are all direct. Even a full dot rotation is nearly 60% direct damage, which is why the Maelstrom 2H works so well. And with the spammable, that percentage rises even further. It's also great to have Carve for longer fights. After the first 30 seconds, the damage per cast is crazy high. But you can use a Maelstrom Inferno instead, damage is maybe 5% behind, and that shrinks if you have Kratis in the group. Finally, the setup from recent patches with a monster set and proc backbar still works if you don't have Runecarver, but it's pretty far behind. Let's face it, there are countless setups that will let you clear content and have fun, but if you want your Necromancer to kick as much ass as possible, I wouldn't stray too far from this format. Next, the pros and cons of different rotations. Higher numbers can be achieved. Rai, for example, posted 130k with both dot and spam rotations, but A, the man's a beast, and B, I kept these rotations as static as possible so they're easier to replicate. Blast Bones and dots, no spam. Not the highest dummy DPS, but great for long trial fights with multiple targets. I've tested it in a few hard modes and sustain is great, damage is solid, and there is so much AoE. Here's Falgraven hard mode with my Arcanist and with my Necromancer. Forget the DPS numbers themselves, this is a chill group run by one of my friends, and we didn't do any skips so the fight was long. The point is that in the same fight, same conditions, same time, and with the same player, the Necro actually beat the Arcanist. I even had to stop and res someone or it would have been even further ahead. I'm not saying Necro is better, just that in ordinary trial conditions, they are in the same ballpark. And the dot rotation is a lot of fun and easier than you think. The 3-second rhythm really helps, plus the fact that Stampede and Caltrops are static, and we have Siphon and Trap as pseudo-spammables when there's nothing else to cast. But it is relentless, and many will prefer to have a spammable. Rotation is the same, blast spins every 3 seconds, keep up your dots but use a spam to fill the gaps. This is the rotation many players will choose because it's more familiar and damage potential is a bit higher for stamina. Sustain is not as good as the dot rotation though, so keep that in mind for long, complex fights. Which spammable then? Stamina has a few options here. Rapid Strikes is cheaper than Skull and hits a little harder, as we already discussed. And if you're still struggling with Sustain, you can use Arterial Burst from the Vampire skill line. This costs Magicka and solves the Sustain issue, even though it raises your regular ability costs by 3%, and because it triggers hemorrhaging with every cast, and hemorrhaging now stacks up to 3 times, you claw back some of that lost damage, literally. I found Arterial Burst to be slightly behind Skull, but if your Sustain is on a knife edge, that small damage loss will be totally worth it. Plus, I'm guessing a Vampire Necromancer appeals to many of you, right? But since Vampirism increases the cost of everything, including ultimates, I suggest saving 2 loadouts in the armory system, with Vampirism and without. Because when you're not using Arterial Burst, you don't want to suffer that cost penalty. Your ults will only be 2 seconds later, but in long fights with multiple targets, it might be a 2 to 3k DPS loss. Magicka Necromancers don't need to worry about Magicka Sustain, Stamina Sustain is more of the issue, and Vampirism therefore creates a problem rather than solving one. So I would just stick with Ricochet Skull. Finally, what if you decide to use Gravelord Sacrifice? This gets rid of that 3-second Blast Bones rhythm and makes Necro more accessible. Zos says they wanted to reduce the intense demand and complex rotation requirement of the class, as Blast Bones demands an activation once every 3 seconds minimum, making it very difficult to maximize and play around. I personally haven't found this to be true. When I learned to play Necro, that 3-second rhythm felt fun and helped me stay on top of the rotation. I think bar swapping is more of the problem. If you haven't learned to bar swap fast, this can be a pain. But that's something that's good for us all to learn eventually, and Blast Bones is a great training tool. Still, there must be people who've begged for another playstyle as an option, and that's what Gravelord Sacrifice is. I don't think it was ever meant to replace Blast Bones as the strongest way to pump out damage, just offer a simpler alternative that wasn't a big DPS loss, and that's pretty much what it does. You cast it every 20 seconds like a buff, keep up your dots, and spam Skull. I found it easiest to pair it up with Deadly Cloak, which also lasts 20 seconds. That meant I didn't have to worry about factoring in the delay between casting the skill and getting the buff. We already went over the numbers for this, not as strong as any of the Blast Bones rotations, but not far behind either. It does have the higher risk of not generating corpses when you need them, and Sustain is a lot tougher with Gravelord Sacrifice. In long fights, we pretty much have to run Sustain food and accept a lower health pool, which could be a setback in tough trials or maybe dungeon hard modes. Then again, if there's a lot of movement, a simpler rotation should be more consistent and let you focus on mechanics and staying out of trouble. It's all relative. So, Blast Bones and Dots is best for sustain and overall damage. Blast Bones and Spams is best for single target damage. Sacrifice and Spams is best for simplicity. A very quick bit on traits and enchantments. Backbar, Infused, Weapon Damage Glyph. You could use Shock, but Weapon Damage is the smart default. With a dual-wield front bar, it's double charged for single target. Nirnhoned and Charged is close behind, losing some status effect damage, but adding more from Blast Bones and Dots, so more cleave. Or if you want to go all in on the AoE damage, Nirnhoned and Precise. It depends on your priority, but most of us don't want to carry around 4 Reliquent daggers for an extra sliver of damage here and there, and you can't go far wrong with double charged or with Nirnhoned and Charged. Same with glyphs. The status effects overhauled in Update 41 means they're all pretty good now, and the differences are small. Burning and Poisoned are dots and buffed by Rapid Rot, so we want those, and Sundered is next in line because it gives us a little damage buff. Diseased is not that strong. 98% uptime against 3 targets, and the AoE component is only 4.4k. Still, it's very nice to have it for free from Blast Bones and Siphon, another reason Necro has got stronger. All this assumes you're using Runecarver, in which case go with Absorb Stamina and Poison Glyphs on the front bar, regardless of traits. That got me my best results. But if you're not using Runecarver, you'll probably want a Flame Glyph in there. And if you're not running Dual Wield but a bow, go with Charged unless you're sure you won't go over 100% crit chance and execute. Then Precise also works. I'd also go with Precise on a Destruction Staff, but I did not do much testing with front bar staves. They don't tend to get great results because we're so split between dots and direct damage, although that has changed a bit with Runecarver. If you're still confused about the charge trait, think of it like this. If all your status effect uptimes are either perfect or really low, it can't do much. But if you have multiple status effects whose uptimes are good but not great, there's something for it to work with, and the bump from an extra charge trait is gonna add up to some nice single target damage. It's situational. I've done my best to test and verify absolutely everything, but always be prepared to tweak things as you go. A big part of this is personal preference. Obviously, do not rock up to group content with a terrible build, that's fucking rude, but don't feel you have to be a slave to the meta either. The best groups do need to hunt for every scrap of damage, but the vast majority of groups have little or no reason to operate like that, so play something you enjoy and are good at and that gets results. Speaking of results, here are 3 dummy tests. All static rotations, or as static as they can get, and quite easy to master in my opinion. Again, all of these numbers go up by 1k or so in Gold Road because of the buff to Detonating Siphon. Stampcrow with Blast Bones and Rapid Strikes, Magcrow with Blast Bones and Dots, Magcrow with Sacrifice and Skull. We don't need to see the whole thing, just enough to show the static rotations in action. Start with Rapid Strikes. Pre-buff with Archer, Cloak, Blast Bones, Shooting Star and Trap. Then it's Blast Bones, Stampede, Caltrops, Blast Bones, Boneyard, Siphon, Blast Bones, Carve, Spam, Blast Bones, Spam, Spam, Blast Bones, Cloak, Boneyard. And we're back to Stampede and Caltrops. That's it. There are quite a few dots, but you can pair up Archer and Cloak as well to make things easier to track. You just gotta make sure you swap after Blast Bones and not after Rapid Strikes, and keep an eye on that Carve timer. The damage does not start super high, but climbs to 120k by 50%, and once we hit Execute, things really kick off. This is why Boneyard is on the front bar, to get more out of that Death Knell Execute passive. Use Dawnbreaker towards the end if you can, and don't recast any dots towards the end. 128.8 from a pretty static rotation. I'll take it. And you can push higher if you really perfect that execute. Next, the Magicka Necromancer with Blast Bones and Dots, this time with 3 dummies to show the cleave potential. Archer, Cloak, Blast Bones, Rune, Star, and Trap. Same rotation as the Stamina Necro with Rapid Strikes, Blast Bones 2, 3, Blast Bones 2, 3. In some ways this is easier because there's no channel to interfere with bar swaps. One potential drawback is Stamina Sustain, which could get a little tight in fights where you need to block a lot. That's where a Stamina Necro makes things easier, since the rotation and damage are the same. You do get a lot more synergies and sustain buffs in content, but yeah, this is a setup where the High Elf spell recharge passive can make a difference. This had the most cleave of any Necromancer setup that I tested. I'm not even looking at the secondary targets, but I'm still casually doing 86, 87k on both of them. Even my Azure Blight DK only got 260k in this situation, and remember, this is still a single target Reliquent setup. Again, a double charged front bar. For multiple targets, Nirnhoned and Charged is very close, but when they're this close together, it's pretty nice that Charged increases our disease ticks on secondary targets, which in turn explode and hit the boss. That's why single target DPS is almost 130k here. That and the shorter cooldown between shooting stars. Both of these things will happen in actual content, and it goes back to what I said before. Magicka and Stamina both work, and Rapid Strikes isn't the only option. 302k DPS. I could have juked it higher, but I wanted to show how much free AoE damage we get even on a single target setup. Finally, a rotation with Gravelord Sacrifice. You can't pre-buff this ability, I just did Cloak, Archer, Shooting Star, Trap, Skull, and then Sacrifice. Then Stampede and Caltrops every 15 seconds. If like me, you're used to the 3-second rhythm to keep track of where you are in the rotation, you can change that to a 5-second rhythm instead, just in your head, if that makes sense. 3 lots of 5 and you're back to the start. Everything else is just recast on cooldown, but you can pair up Cloak with Sacrifice and Trap with Archer since they all last 20 seconds. Keep an eye on Carve and do not let it run out, and then just spam away. The damage is lower than a Blast Bones rotation, and honestly it would help quite a bit if we could just pre-buff Sacrifice out of combat. That may be something the devs are planning to add, so if you're watching this a few months after I posted it, that may no longer be an issue. Fingers crossed. Anyway, having to cast it as combat begins gets us off to a slower start. Again, I didn't have as much time to test this setup in content. I just wanted to show that it can get pretty decent numbers on the dummy, almost 120k ain't bad, and that the setup works, despite what you may read on Reddit. There is way too much ESO babble out there, which is just wrong, so always look for sources who actually test and can back up what they're saying. Execute, same as the others. Use Dawnbreaker if it comes around, and don't recast any dots in the last 6 to 8 seconds or so. That's pretty much it. A bit easier than the others, especially for people who find the 3-second deadline of Blast Bones hectic or stressful. 118.8 is not super high, but it's similar to static rotations for Magicka Arcanist or Magicka Nightblade at the moment, and there is still a lot of free AoE damage going on, even without Blast Bones. In a 3-target test, you lose about 10k DPS per target, but it's still pretty good. Now do yourself a favor and play this video again, maybe next time you do your writs or something. There is a lot to take in and it took a lot of work. I hope you enjoyed it and it helps you get a better perspective and better results, because that's the whole point. If you want to see more content like this, there are a few ways to make it happen. Tell me in the comments. Support us by joining the members area and get bonus content, sub on Twitch, or the free stuff like subbing here on YouTube, sharing the content, joining our Discord. We are grateful for all of it, and we're going to keep doing this until you guys tell us to stop. Thank you for getting us this far, and as always, thanks for watching.